The silver clattered against the fine china, a rhythmic, hollow sound that filled the dining hall. Nico watched his father gesture with a heavy hand, pontificating on land acquisitions that he barely understood. Around the table, the others nodded in synchronized, performative agreement. It was a play, and they were all performing roles they had not written. Nico traced the rim of his glass, his silence mistaken for absence. In reality, he was dismantling them piece by piece. He measured their greed against their incompetence, calculating the exact moment their vanity would lead to their ruin. His mind worked like a machine, grinding through their empty rhetoric to find the leverage he needed. Every smile they exchanged was a tactical error. Every boast was a crack in their foundation. He did not need to shout to be felt. He simply observed, cataloging their flaws with a cold, surgical precision that left no room for error. They believed they were the masters of this house, but they were merely occupants of a structure he had already mapped for collapse. The resentment simmered beneath his ribs, a constant, sharp pressure that fueled his every thought. He was the only one in the room who understood the truth. They were standing on a precipice, and he was the only one who knew exactly how hard to push. The family treated Nico like a piece of furniture that had been damaged in transport. They spoke around him, over him, and occasionally at him, but never with him. When he entered a room, the conversation would pivot to safe, shallow topics, as if his presence were a disruption to their carefully curated atmosphere. His father would offer a patronizing pat on the shoulder, a gesture that never reached his eyes, while his siblings maintained a distance that bordered on physical avoidance. They saw only the physical remnants of the accident that had shaped his early years, not the capacity for thought that burned beneath his surface. Once, during a debate on estate management, Nico offered a correction regarding a tax discrepancy. The room went quiet. His mother looked at him with an expression of weary tolerance, then resumed her previous point without acknowledging he had spoken at all. It was a calculated erasure. They did not fear his intellect. They chose to ignore it entirely to preserve their own comfort. He was a broken antique in their eyes, something to be kept in the corner and occasionally polished for the sake of appearances. This systematic exclusion was their greatest mistake, for it gave him the silence he needed to watch them without being seen. For 2 decades, Nico treated his own mind like a blade on a whetstone. Every insult he absorbed, every dismissive glance he endured, was channeled into the cold logic of his intellectual arsenal. He did not react with anger. He reacted with data. When his brother boasted of a new business venture, Nico did not argue. Instead, he presented a single ledger entry that pointed to a looming fiscal disaster. He watched the color drain from his brother's face, the sudden, frantic stutter replacing the earlier arrogance. It was a surgical strike. He found their secrets, mapped their vulnerabilities, and waited for the precise moment to apply pressure. He became a fixture in the library, surrounded by accounts, legal precedents, and records of past failures. He knew the exact cost of their extravagance and the precise date their credit would vanish. The family felt the sting of his presence not through his words, but through the sudden, inexplicable collapses of their plans. He was the invisible architect of their anxiety. Every time they looked at him, they saw the shadow of the boy they had dismissed, unaware that the man standing before them had already dismantled their future. He was no longer a victim of their neglect. He was the primary auditor of their inevitable downfall. The shift in power did not go unnoticed by Eleanor. She watched the way Nico navigated the household, the way his silence now held the weight of a threat. She decided that his autonomy had become a liability. In the autumn of 1923, she called him into the parlor, her expression devoid of warmth. She did not ask for his opinion. She informed him that a marriage contract had been drawn with the Ferrante family. It was a tactical strike. By pairing him with a farmer's daughter, she intended to anchor him to a life of mediocrity, forcing him to account for someone else's status rather than his own. She spoke of the union as a settling of accounts, a way to remind him of his place in the hierarchy. The family watched the exchange from the doorway, sensing a shift in the wind. They expected him to refuse, to lash out with the sharp, cold logic he had used against them for years. Instead, Nico remained still, his gaze fixed on the paper she held. He understood the intent immediately. It was not a marriage. It was a cage designed by his own mother to stifle his reach. Eleanor left the room, satisfied that she had finally reclaimed the upper hand. The family went about their evening, convinced that the threat of his intellect had been effectively neutralized by the prospect of a domestic burden. The heavy oak doors of the estate groaned open, signaling the arrival of the carriage from the valley. Rosa stepped onto the stone threshold, not with the hesitant steps of a subordinate, but with the steady pace of someone walking onto her own land. Inside, the household staff frozen in their tasks, waiting for the expected signs of discomfort or awe. None came. She paused in the center of the foyer, her gaze sweeping over the vast, cold geometry of the hall. A maid rushed forward to take her bags, attempting to steer her toward the servants' quarters, but Rosa simply shifted the weight of her belongings, sidestepping the offer with a polite, firm shake of her head. She did not look at the walls or the opulence. She looked at the people. Her presence was a weight, pressing down on the air in the room, effectively silencing the murmurs that had been building since the announcement of the match. The family watched from the mezzanine, their expectations of a timid, easily managed girl crumbling in real time. She did not seek approval. She did not offer apologies for her background. She stood in the heart of the house, anchored and entirely unmoved by the architecture of their vanity. The silence she brought with her was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of an incoming tide. Nico retreated to his study, closing the heavy door with a deliberate, sharp click. He needed the space to reassert the hierarchy his mother had sought to dismantle. He sat behind his desk, lining up his pens and papers with mechanical precision, creating a fortress of order. When the door opened again, he did not look up. He launched into his prepared script, his voice devoid of inflection. He spoke of the marriage as a temporary arrangement, a strictly functional necessity that required absolute distance. He detailed the rules of the house, the expectation of silence, and the requirement that she remain within her designated quarters unless summoned. He waited for the hesitation, the shuffle of feet, or the stutter of apology. It did not come. He looked up, expecting to see a girl burdened by the weight of his coldness. Instead, he found her standing by the bookshelves, her hands resting lightly on the wood. She did not look at him with fear or resentment. She looked at him with a steady, unflinching curiosity that felt entirely alien. He repeated his demands, raising his voice to sharpen the edges of his words, but the air in the room remained stubbornly still. The boundary he had drawn with such care felt invisible to her. He had offered a cage, and she had refused to step inside. Nico finished his list of demands, his knuckles white against the edge of the desk. He held his breath, waiting for the expected retreat. The silence stretched, measured by the rhythmic, slow tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. He glanced at her, expecting a sign of submission. Rosa did not move toward the door. She did not lower her head. Instead, she took a slow step toward the small side table where a silver tray sat untouched. She turned to him, her gaze level and entirely devoid of the fear he had spent 20 years cultivating in others. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. The question hung in the air, stripped of any hidden motive, utterly disconnected from the cold, transactional ultimatum he had just delivered. Nico stared. The words were a direct violation of his authority, a domestic intrusion that bypassed his anger as if it were nothing more than a passing draft. He opened his mouth to repeat his command, but the rhythm of the moment had been shattered. The air in the study felt different. It was no longer a space for his isolation, but a room shared by two people where his rules no longer applied. He sat back, his pulse thumping against the sudden quiet collapse of his control. Nico did not answer the question. He returned to his ledger, hoping that if he buried himself in figures, she would vanish into the hallway. She did not. Instead, she pulled a chair to the corner of the room, near the lamp, and opened a book. The rustle of paper was soft, yet it cut through the silence of the study with the precision of a blade. He tried to focus, but the scratch of her pen and the steady, rhythmic turning of pages drew his attention. He looked up, intending to demand she leave, but the sight of her reading halted him. She was not waiting for his permission to be there. She was simply existing in the space, her focus fixed entirely on the text, as if he were no more than part of the furniture. He stared at her for a long minute, his jaw tight, waiting for her to break. She did not look up. She did not fidget. She remained perfectly still, a quiet anchor in the center of his chaotic resentment. He turned back to his desk, but the work felt hollow. The study was no longer his fortress. It was a shared room where her silence was louder than any argument he could have constructed. He could not force her out, and for the first time in years, he did not know how to regain control. Nico pushed the ledgers aside, the sound of wood scraping against stone echoing in the room. He needed to break the stillness. He started with the basics, dismantling the life she had left behind. He spoke of the dirt on her father's hands, the smell of the fields that still clung to her memory, and the absurdity of her presence in a house built on different foundations. He paced the length of the desk, his voice sharp, picking at the details of her upbringing like a vulture circling a carcass. He mocked the simplicity of her father's values, framing them as a sign of weakness and intellectual poverty. He stopped directly in front of her, leaning down to ensure she could not ignore the vitriol in his tone. He waited for a flinch. He waited for her to defend her bloodline or retreat into a display of hurt. He wanted her to show the cracks he was certain existed beneath that calm exterior. He threw the word peasant at her like a stone, watching for the impact. She did not look up from her book. She did not even blink. The only sound in the room remained the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock, mocking his attempt to regain power through cruelty. Nico did not stop. He moved to the bookshelf, pulling down volumes to slam them onto the table, hoping the noise would shatter her composure. He recounted stories of the Ferrante farm, twisting her father's harvest into a narrative of failure and insignificance. He stood over her, his shadow falling across the pages of her book, blocking her light. He waited for her to push back, to scream, or even to leave the room in frustration. She turned a page. The movement was fluid, deliberate, and entirely indifferent to his presence. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, and whispered his insults directly into the space between them. He wanted to see the flicker of anger in her eyes, a sign that his words had finally pierced the barrier. She looked at the text, traced a line with her finger, and sighed with the quiet annoyance of someone interrupted by a minor pest. She did not rise to the bait. She did not offer a rebuttal. She simply adjusted her shawl and continued reading, leaving him standing in the center of the room, his breath coming in jagged, uneven bursts. The logic of his cruelty had no purchase here. He was shouting into a void that refused to echo back. Nico retreated to the sideboard, his movements sharp and uncoordinated. He poured a glass of wine, his fingers tight around the stem, and drained it in one motion. He set the glass down with a crack that echoed against the mahogany. He began again, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. He accused her of playing a part, of being a plant sent by Eleanor, to monitor his every failure. He listed the ways she was
Stop letting life hold you back and start winning today. The TPP system is the incredible tool that turned my struggles into total success. Click the link in the description right now to unlock your own amazing
intruder, a foreign object in the precise architecture of his life. He paced behind her chair, stopping to lean over her shoulder, his breath hitching as he searched for any tremor in her frame. He mocked her silence, calling it a mask for a calculating mind. He grabbed a paperweight from the desk and turned it over in his hands, his knuckles white. He spoke of his own worthlessness, projecting it onto her, claiming she was merely waiting for his inevitable collapse to claim the household for herself. He waited for her to deny it, to defend her integrity with a sharp word or a sudden movement. She sat perfectly still. She did not defend herself. She did not offer a single word to counter his accusations. The air in the study thickened, heavy with the weight of his unspent fury. He tightened his grip on the object in his hand, feeling the edges bite into his palm, and turned his gaze toward the door, already crafting the next, sharper lie. Nico dropped the paperweight onto the desk. The sound was a sharp, final punctuation to his pacing. He began to walk the perimeter of the study, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. He stopped directly in front of her, leaning his weight onto his knuckles until the wood groaned. He shifted his focus from her character to her origins, stripping away the pretense of his previous arguments. He spoke of the dirt under her father's fingernails, the smell of manure that clung to the family name, and the pathetic, labor-worn hands of a man who had nothing to show for his life but debt. He mocked the way her father bowed to landowners, painting him as a submissive creature unworthy of respect. Nico's voice rose, losing its calculated chill, replaced by a raw, jagged edge of malice. He threw every detail of her rural upbringing into the air like debris, demanding she acknowledge the filth of her heritage. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, and delivered the final, calculated blow. He declared that her father was nothing more than a parasite, a man so fundamentally small that he would spend his entire life begging for scraps at the gates of the Calvieri estate. He stopped, his chest heaving, waiting for the ruin he had spent hours orchestrating. The air in the study went thin. Nico stood over her, his breath rattling in his chest, waiting for the expected collapse. Rosa did not flinch. She did not look away. She slowly closed the book in her lap, the sound of the pages folding against each other loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. She stood up. She did not retreat. She walked until she was within arm's reach of him, forcing him to look down into her eyes. The heat of his fury hit a wall of cold, hard focus. She waited for the echo of his last word to die away before she spoke. Her voice was steady, lacking any tremor of fear or anger. She told him that his father, the man he strove to impress with such cruelty, would be ashamed of this display. She listed no reasons. She offered no defense. She simply held the mirror of his own father's legacy up to his face. Nico opened his mouth to retort, to bury her in another layer of vitriol, but the words stalled. He looked at her, then past her, his gaze landing on the empty chair. The truth of her statement sat between them, heavy and undeniable. His hands fell to his sides, the tension in his shoulders snapping, and for the first time, he had no answer. Nico turned away. He walked to the heavy oak desk and gripped the edge until his knuckles turned white, but the silence followed him. It was no longer the silence of his own making, but a thick, suffocating presence that seemed to weigh on the very floorboards. He stared at the inkwell, watching the reflection of the lamp flame dance on the black surface. He tried to construct a defense, a cutting remark to shatter the stillness, but his mind refused to engage. Every attempt to frame a response felt hollow, a flimsy mask sliding off a face that no longer recognized itself. Rosa remained by the chair, motionless. She did not press her advantage. She did not offer a follow-up. She simply existed in the space, her presence acting as a grounding weight that forced him to confront the vacuum he had created. Nico moved to the window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the night was featureless and dark. He realized then that he had spent 2 decades sharpening his tongue to carve out a space where he could be untouchable. Now, he was merely alone, caught in the wake of a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. The silence in the room had become a mirror, and for the first time, he was forced to look. He exhaled, the sound thin and ragged against the stillness. Nico pushed away from the window, his movements stiff, as if his body were relearning how to navigate the space. He walked to the desk, intending to bury himself in the ledger, but his hand hovered over the ink-stained paper. The numbers and names that once provided his sense of order now looked like meaningless marks. He did not sit. He paced the length of the rug, back and forth, counting the steps. Every turn brought him face to face with Rosa. She had not moved. Her steady, rhythmic breathing was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise he had cultivated for years. He stopped mid-stride. He looked at his own hands, the ones he had used to push away every bridge he had ever built. The habit of bitterness was a weight he was finally putting down. Slowly, he pulled the heavy wooden chair out and sat. He did not look at her, but he did not order her out. He rested his elbows on the desk, his head falling into his hands. The walls he had fortified with 2 decades of insults were not just silent now. They were falling away, leaving him exposed and, for the first time, not entirely certain of what would replace them. The heavy front door groaned as Nico pushed it open, his movements sluggish and heavy. He did not look for his mother or the staff. He climbed the stairs with a dragging gait, his mind echoing with the insults and failed maneuvers of the afternoon meeting. He entered the study, fully expecting the room to be empty, ready to collapse into the familiar comfort of his own bitterness. He stopped. Rosa was sitting in the corner chair, the dim light catching the edge of her book. He stood by the doorway, his hands trembling slightly, waiting for the expected remark about his failure. It never came. He walked to the center of the room, bracing for a lecture or the hollow sting of pity. Instead, she simply closed the book and set it aside. She did not stand. She did not offer a comforting word that would have felt like an insult. She just watched him with a steady, quiet gaze that demanded nothing. For years, he had operated on the assumption that every interaction was a transaction of power. Here, there was no power to be gained. The air in the room shifted, shedding its sharp, jagged edge. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his shoulders, and pulled up a chair to sit in the quiet space she had maintained for him. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a dull, pulsing red, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nico sat motionless, his back against the wood of the chair. He waited for the familiar urge to lash out, to reclaim control, to dissect the silence with a biting remark. It did not come. The silence, which had always felt like a cage designed to keep the world at bay, now held a different quality. It was porous. It allowed the sound of their breathing to mingle in the center of the room. He turned his head slowly. Rosa remained in the corner, her hands resting flat on her lap. She did not seek his gaze or demand an explanation for his collapse. She simply occupied the space beside him. He looked at the desk, at the scattered ledgers he had spent years obsessing over. They looked like paper and ink, nothing more. The weight he had carried since childhood, the need to prove his intellect against a family that saw him as a fractured object, suddenly lacked its anchor. He shifted his weight, and for the first time in his life, he did not reach for a defensive gesture. He let his arms hang loose at his sides. The barrier was gone. Nico turned his head, his eyes tracking the dust motes dancing in the dying light of the hearth. He looked at her, his voice raspy from hours of silence. "Why do you stay?" he asked. He expected the usual deflection or a reminder of her duty to his mother. Instead, she leaned forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight. "Because beneath that anger," she said, "there is a man worth knowing." The words landed with an impact that made him flinch. He looked down at his hands, the same hands he had used to sharpen his insults and dismantle the dignity of everyone who entered this house. He thought of the months of cruelty, the mockery of her father, and the calculated attempts to make her break. He felt the cold, hard shell he had constructed since he was 9 years old begin to fracture. He opened his mouth, stopped, and tried again. "I have been a monster to you," he said, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the embers. "For every word I spat, for every doubt I cast, I am sorry." He did not look away. The ego that had fueled his existence for 2 decades lay in ruins between them. For the first time, he did not feel the need to defend his position. He simply waited for her response. Rosa stood up, crossed the short distance between them, and placed her hand on the back of his chair. She did not speak, but the presence of her hand provided a physical anchor he had lacked for decades. Nico looked around the study. The ledgers, which had once been his only territory, seemed small and inconsequential. The darkness in the room no longer felt like a barrier or a cage. It was simply the end of the day. He stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked to the window and pushed the heavy curtains aside, revealing the moonlight hitting the garden path. He had worn a shell of resentment since he was 9 years old, a rigid architecture of insults and defensive distance. That armor was gone. He turned back to see her watching him, her expression steady and expectant. There was no need to reclaim his stature or sharpen his tongue. He walked back to the desk and closed the ledger, leaving it unfinished. He pulled a second chair into the light. He gestured for her to sit. The house outside was silent, but for the first time, he did not find the silence heavy. It was a space they now shared, a partnership carved out of the ruins of his former life. He sat down, looked at her, and finally stopped searching for a way out. Nico reached across the desk, his fingers tracing the heavy embossed seal on the family ledger. For years, he had utilized his intellect to sting, to deflect, and to survive, but the purpose had always been small. Now, he saw the patterns of his family's vanity for what they were, structural weaknesses. He looked at Rosa, who stood by the door, her posture perfectly still. She was no longer just a farmer's daughter forced into his world. She was the missing component of his leverage. He stood up and walked to the wall safe, turning the dial with a steady hand. He retrieved documents that Eleanor had kept locked away for a decade. The ink on the pages detailed the corruption that sustained their status, secrets that could dismantle the entire Calvieri reputation in a single afternoon. He placed the papers on the desk. He did not look for pity or validation. He looked for the precise point of failure. The family expected a broken man, a recluse they could ignore. They were not prepared for the man who had regained his clarity, nor were they ready for the ally who stood at his side. He adjusted the lamp, illuminating the files, and let the silence of the room deepen. The power dynamic had shifted. The Calvieri household remained oblivious, but the architecture of their control was already beginning to collapse.